We have about 1 hour of content. It's one of the first times in my webinar history. I'm not sure whether I'm going to get through all of the content the way I would like to in 1 hour. We could cover this subject off in days, but I do want to give you some insights into some really important things that we found. The starting point in this, to me, is managers in organization. In my career previously in the Red Cross in Canada, in the International Red Cross, leading other organizations, and then as a management consultant for many years, the role of the manager in organizations came to me as one that is very, very critical. And if you think about it, a manager in the organization is, I don't know, 10% plus or minus of your staff in the organization. And if you can get it right with them, that's the key link. They're the ones that are holding the pieces of the puzzle in terms of the strategy being implemented across the organization overall. So that the role of the manager is a really, really important one. Unfortunately, from the perspective of the manager in organizations, what they see is much like this. They're being pulled in many different directions in the day-to-day basis, and that is getting them in the way of focusing on their really most important work. So by the end of the day, what managers are feeling is that their piece of the puzzle is a burden. It's really, really difficult for them to focus in on those things that they know that are important, and our research really does reinforce that. So in order to understand this better and to understand how we can create a situation in organizations that looks more like this, where everybody understands what their piece of the puzzle is and they're all contributing and coordinating, we wanted to dive into that and understand what was happening in organizations that caused this not to be the case. So we did do some research with the University of Ottawa. This was part of one of my retirement projects when I thought I was going to be retiring several years ago now. And I did a lot of reading and studying and trying to understand what was happening in organizations. And I'm very beholden to my colleagues, especially Professor Swigo, a professor now emeritus at the University of Ottawa at the Telfer School of Management, where we managed to put our arms around this situation of managers in the organizations. And we learned some very profound things, which I'm going to share with you. That's what led to this company, Effective Managers, and that what leads me here to wanting to share some of these findings with you, because I think they can be so helpful to so many in organizations. So what I have for you today is to share with you is a piece of the puzzle in a different sense, is how you in your organizations can really learn and focus in on those things that can really make a difference to organizational effectiveness in your own situations. So let me just get caught up here. Because of how all my windows open, I can't see all of the slides that are up, but I want to make sure that I'm talking about the right things. So the starting point for us then really is what is management effectiveness. And sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen going here. There we go. So then, now once we get to effectiveness, we want to really understand what is the main driver of effectiveness in organizations. And I started out with thinking that this was probably the case, and it actually was, and it was reinforced very much through our research that accountability is that main driver for effectiveness in organizations. And that comes as a result of this correlation that we found very strongly in organizations. So organizations with higher degrees of accountability have higher degrees of effectiveness. And this is correlated to a very high degree, 0.74. A correlation of 1 in this kind of research is 100%. It's like wheels on a car when you're driving down the road. They're 100% correlated. A correlation of 0 means it's random. There's no correlation between the two. So this 0.74 means that if you can get accountability right, you can go a long, long ways to getting effectiveness right. Of course, there's other things you have to do, but getting accountability right is the fundamental piece in the organization that you have. The starting point then is if we understand that accountability is important to us, is understanding what accountability is. And there is no standard definition in management sciences, surprisingly enough. So Professor Go and I developed this one for our research, and this is the core definition that we have for accountability in the effective manager's approach. So starting off, accountability is an obligation. So this is something that I feel obligated to do. The second is it's something for which I can be held to account, both for my results, but also for the actions that contributed to the results that I have. So I can be held to account for my results and for my actions. And the third component is really important and forgotten by many, and that there's this specified other. So I am accountable to another individual for these results. And that becomes really, really important in organizations if you think about it. Because accountability is very, very different from responsibility. They're both important in organizations. So responsibility of an individual is important in terms of them wanting to do well. Accountability is very important in terms of being held to account for your actions within an organization. A quick example just to help you get your head around this concept. Responsibility is driven internally. So this is an internal value set that you would have as an individual of wanting to do something in a particular way. And my favorite example is you're walking down the hallway in an organization, and you see some litter on the floor. So you reach down, pick up the litter, and throw it in the trash. So you feel responsible to keep your workplace neat. That's an inner held belief. Others in the workplace may not feel the same way. But there is a janitorial staff in the building that are accountable for keeping the workplace clean. So there's the difference between accountability and responsibility. And as you can see, responsibility is important because we do want to feel responsible for helping our colleagues and working in the best way possible, but it's very different from accountability. So here's one of the key findings that was a real mind bender for me to help understand accountability in organizations. Because in my experience, in a career in many different situations, people do want to do well in organizations. And yet it seemed that there was something in the accountability area that was causing people not to be able to focus in on their real work, and it was hard for me to try to reconcile those two concepts. So this just turned the light on for me. The finding is that there are actually two different dimensions of accountability. The first is felt accountability. So how strongly do I feel accountable for doing good work? And that felt accountability is a mean of 8.93. This was on a 10-point Likert scale, so that's almost 9 out of 10. If we're 0.7 higher, 0.07 higher, it would be an A plus in terms of the strength of this variable. So felt accountability is very strong. People do want to do well, and they feel accountable for doing good work. The second dimension, though, is clarity of accountability. So how clearly do I understand that for which I'm going to be held to account? And the score there is 6.9 out of 10, so just under 7 out of 10. A huge a lot of room for improvement in organizations. If I was writing a term paper, I might be satisfied with the C- as my score. But if I'm running an organization and the results of my managers being effective or not depends on this clarity of accountability, that 30% margin for improvement is just not acceptable. There's lots of room for organizations to do better in the work they need to do. So the key takeaway for you from this one is whether or not you have an organization where clear accountabilities are set for individuals, the question isn't whether or not they'll feel accountable. We know they're going to feel accountable. The question is whether or not they're going to feel accountable for the right things. So part of the accountability and authority framework then that I'll be talking about today is how do we ensure that people feel accountable for and are able to focus in on the right things in terms of accomplishing the things that they need to do in their work. So then the second question becomes, why does accountability matter? I think I've given you sort of intuitively that accountability is important, but there's lots of other research and findings out there that can help us to understand that there is work that can be done, and there is research that supports how important accountability is. So the starting point from this part of why accountability is important is with the strategy of the organization. in my experience, most organizations are pretty good at developing strategies. They have the process in place, they gather information, they have the stakeholder analysis, they do the SWOT analysis, they do the environmental scans, they consult broadly within the organization, and they come up with their strategy, which starts with the vision of where we want to be at some time in the future. So organizations are pretty good at that, but invariably, 3 or 5 or 10 years down the road, when your strategy should have been implemented, the vision looks more like this result. So instead of the wonderful Pegasus that you envisioned, you end up with the kind of sad-looking horse that, well, I guess he's a happy-looking, but not very great-looking horse. So the question then is how did this happen? How did we go off the rails? And the answer to that question is, it's not through anyone's ill intent. It's not because people don't want to achieve the strategy. There are other forces at work, and this is the why part about why accountability is important. Because when it comes to strategy implementation, it's quite clear in the research, as you see on your screen here, that 70% of organizations fail to achieve their strategy. If you read Dr. Cotter, who's an expert in strategy execution, he goes even further and says only 5% of organizations actually achieve their strategies. He agrees with the 70% through a meta-analysis that don't achieve it, and then the other 25% in the middle, he says, are midland, which is exactly what that is. So they don't achieve their entire strategy, but they may achieve some parts of it. So the takeaway on this one is around the impact of people not understanding what they're accountable for on your ability to execute the strategy of the organization. And I bundle all of that into a term that I call churn. Now, churn is the turnover of staff in your organization, but I also think of churn as what happens in an organization when people are not able to focus in on that important work. I've got a whole webinar on this one, so I'm not going to get into too much detail here. I just wanted to give you a great sense, a bit of a sense of where we're going. So if we think of organizations then, and we try to understand why most strategies fail to be implemented, one of the starting points is this result of the research that we did with the Telfer School of Management. And as you'll see from this side, managers are highly interdependent in organizations. Organizations are complex places to work. Even relatively small organizations that are trying to establish something new or in startup phase where you might have a handful of people are relatively complex. And that's because we all depend on others to be able to do our work. And in the absence of others being able to support us in doing that work, we won't be as successful as we could be. This finding from our research at the Telfer School of Management really reinforces this. So 36 of managers identify that work does not flow smoothly across their organization, and almost 50% are experiencing conflict in their situation. Here's in their roles, with other roles in the organization. Here's some other research that was published a couple of years ago by Sull, Holmes, and Sull, which was really enlightening to me because it told the story that I felt in the organizations and that many of you feel, I know. Only 9% of managers say they can rely on colleagues to do what they say they will do. 9%, so that's only 1 out of 10 employees, if they're promised something by someone else in another part of the organization, feel that they can rely on that person to actually do what they said they would do. And in organizations where they attempt to fix this kind of a situation are not doing very well. As you see on the slide here, these are handled badly 2 times out of 3. The conflict is may be resolved, but only after a significant amount of time, or it may not be resolved well, or it may be just left to fester. I call that the you're an adult now, work it out school of thought, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So this whole concept then of organizational churn really does have an impact on organizations, because people are so interdependent on each other in organizations, and if they don't understand how they relate to each other so that they're all got their piece of the puzzle, coming back to that graphic at the beginning, then for sure they're not going to be as effective as they can be and start working at cross cross purposes in the organization. So that's the introduction for these. I wanted to talk a little bit about the what and the why. There's the what and the why, excuse me. There's more information on our YouTube channel on the what is accountability and the why does accountability matter. These are the first two issues, first two editions of our YouTube series in accountability, and those are available to you. It's all free of charge, but if you do log on and have a look at those, please subscribe, because it gives me an idea of what's happening, and it means that you'll be automatically notified in the future of any additions to our library. So I'm going to change direction here. Up until now, I really wanted to establish this what and why, because in the Accountability 101 that I have for you today, we really need to think about the fundamental understanding of what accountability is. So what is the solution? One thing I would say at the beginning is that most organizations realize there's a problem. You're on this webinar today because you realize there's something you can do to help improve this situation, either within yourself, on your team, or in your organization. But the solutions tend not to be coming in at the root cause. They seem to be coming in at the symptoms. So they'll run programs for running better meetings. So they're feeling that there's too many meetings, people aren't making decisions, things aren't happening. So they send people away to learn how to do meetings better. Or they feel this role conflict and lack of work moving smoothly across the organization. So they'll send people away on team training, or they'll do team building exercises, or they'll increase their communication programs in the organization. Or they'll say we need better leaders, so they send people away on leadership training and so on. So a lot of money and a lot of resources get spent every year on tackling this. But when I talk to heads of HR and I talk to CEOs, there's increasing skepticism about whether this training is paying off, and for logical reasons, as you'll see in a minute. And to understand what's happening, there's a couple of points to make. The first is another research finding that we had as part of our research with Telfer, and that is that managers spend only 55% of their time doing value-added work. 55% of their time. So 45% of the time, almost half of their time, is doing stuff that they don't feel is adding value to the job that they feel that they should be doing. That was amazing to me. I'd heard similar kinds of discussions, but that's the first time that was done, identified through a rigorous scientific research. The second takeaway then, if you think about if managers are spending only 55% of their time on value-added work, the second question is, what is value-added work? So I think of it in three different components. The first component I talk about as their day job. This is work that they need to do in order to keep the place running. Okay, so manager comes in the morning and there's a certain amount of work that they need to do just to keep the team on point and to meet their obligations for the day. The second is any work that they might be on where they've been delegated to be on projects or any change initiatives. And in that work, what I find is that that's usually pretty well defined. So you're on a project team meeting, you have to show up with the project team, and you'll have certain deliverables, and you'll have a time frame by which you must complete those. So those are pretty well defined. The third piece, which managers must do, and which is value-added work, is their managerial leadership work. So the work of the coaching and the performance feedback and the setting of context and the giving feedback and the receiving feedback, all of the things that a manager needs to do to ensure that their subordinate managers are doing the right work needs to be done. So that's the managerial leadership work. So if you think of these three kinds of work as different buckets of work, and you're only able to spend 55% of your day on this work because the rest of it is in churn, what is it that you think is slipping in organizations? It's not going to be the day-to-day work because they'll be hauled on the carpet before you know it. It's not going to be the change initiative work because that's well measured and they have to deliver within a certain time frame. It's going to be this managerial leadership work. It's just going to be very easy to say, you know, we'll have our performance management meeting next week instead of this week, or the coaching session, we'll have it next month at our regular meeting, or we're not going to have our team meeting today. All of those things are too easy. So as a result, the managerial leadership doesn't get done, and as a result, all of this understanding of the context of the work and the clarity of delegation of what I'm accountable for doesn't happen. And if this clarity of accountability is not there, there's two impacts on the organization. One is my own clarity of action. What should I be focusing on? And if that's not clear to me, I am going to be pulled in all of these different directions by clients and colleagues in other parts of the organization, and urgent tasks that may not be as important. But it also contributes to this clarity of interaction. How do we ensure that that we work smoothly across the organization, because I understand well my job vis-a-vis your job and how we're going to work together. So this clarity of accountability needs to cover off both of those. So that was the bridge. So we talked about the what and the why, and then I talked about the importance of an accountability framework and what that impact is. And now what it will do is move on to the effective point of accountability, which is the system that we've developed following our research, and which is based on excellent work of others, which I will come to before, and which has now been tested in many organizations and implemented. And thank you. Some of our clients are actually on the line now, and will have heard some of this before, but hopefully find it to be a helpful refresher. So if we think about accountability and authority in organizations, the word that I like to use is framework. I think of a framework as the container within which things happen. So if you're building a house, the frame of the house is that part of the house upon which everything else is built. So that frame has to be solid. So a framework then is a concept in terms of for an accountability and authority framework, how we manage here and how we collaborate here. So it sets that framework for how we're going to work together, either in a manager-subordinate relationship or in a peer relationship as we go forward. So if we're going to do that, then we need to have terms and definitions in terms of how I delegate work down the organization. But we also need to have terms and definitions in terms of how we're going to collaborate across the organization. So in the following slides, before our hour is up, I want to talk a bit about the work coming down the organization, but because most organizations are pretty good at that, I'm also going to focus in on and spend a bit more time on work that goes across the organization. In terms of those relationships and in terms of services. So I think of these as the rules of the road. If you're driving from home to work in the morning and you didn't have any traffic rules, so there's no signal lights, there's no traffic lights, there's not even any rule about which side of the road you drive on, who yields to whom in different situations. If none of that existed, imagine the gridlock. It's just kind of a free-for-all of everybody, like a bunch of sheep trying to get down from one place to another. It just wouldn't work. It's the same thing exactly in organizations. If we don't have the rules of the road for how we work together in the organization, we each have to kind of make it up as we go along, and it becomes churn, which detracts from us to be able to be successful in the work that we need to do. So in terms of work flowing down the organization, just a few slides on this because it's important, but most organizations do fairly well at this already. So if you don't have this framework in place and you start with the CEO is in charge of the strategy process, gets the strategy implemented in the organization, and begins to get the strategy implemented in the organization, has this vision. But if the work isn't done in terms of the managerial work that the CEO personally needs to do with the vice presidents in terms of making very crystal clear, setting context, delegating about how we are going to work differently, delegating crisply in terms of what the VP will be held accountable for in terms of doing what they need to do, being really crisp and clear with each of the VPs about how they need to collaborate with each other. If the CEO doesn't do this work, then what will happen is each CEO is going to have their own filter on this, and the filter that they have is going to take them slightly off course from the vision of the strategy. And each level of the organization that you go down, it's going to get slightly worse. It's kind of like the children's game where you whisper in somebody's ear and you go all the way around the circle, and what comes out of the other end isn't what went in the first end. So the same kinds of thing happens in organizations. So the starting point is the CEO needs to ensure that there is this framework in place for ensuring that work is delegated clearly and crisply down the organization, and also that the CEO sets the scene and sets the example in terms of doing that work with the vice presidents. And if that happens, then we can have a situation where everybody is aligned, people are focused in on the most important work, and yes, the urgent stuff is there, and yes, some of the urgent stuff isn't going to get done, but at least at the end of the day, you are doing the important work, and you're keeping the organization on track for implementing its strategy over time. So if we think then about delegation of work, and I know this looks like a pretty complex slide, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just to make the point that at each level of the organization, if I'm a vice president, then I'm accountable for, based on the delegation that I've received from my CEO, I'm accountable for doing my own value-added work. I'm accountable for delegating down to the next level that work which either I'm not going to personally do or which has to be done to support me in my work. Delegate that down clearly, set context, and then the next level down will provide me with feedback in an ongoing way and also do their own value-added work and so on. So this becomes which we get much more into in implementation with clients in terms of how we actually ensure that this happens clearly and crisply in organizations. So the framework for that in terms of work, and I have a paper on a blog on it actually on the website, and there's a webinar on this. It's the 5 requirements of effective managers. So if managers are going to do this delegation work clearly, they need to do these 5 things. They need to have their own plan, which is a subset of their manager's plan. They need to do their own value-added work. They need to set context and boundaries for the subordinates that they have on their team. They then need to really crisply delegate and clearly delegate those things which they're going to be holding their managers accountable for, and they have to establish appropriate feedback loops. So each one of these is an accountability, and it comes along with authorities that are required by the manager for them to be able to do their work. And so on this slide, and you do have this as a handout, I won't walk through it line by line, you can read, but for each accountability as a manager, you then have these authorities that you require to be able to do your work effectively. And I talk a lot about accountability. I have been talking a lot about accountability, and forgive me for not saying accountability and authority every time, but that's really, really important. Every time we do talk about accountability, it comes with a certain amount of authority, because if we delegate accountability in the organization and we don't also delegate the authority, then we have a situation where somebody's hands are tied. They feel accountable for producing a result, but they don't have authority to get the work done, so they have to use their force of personality, their goodwill, their charisma to try to get things done. And at the end of the day, they may, but it was a heck of a lot harder than had they been given the authority that they would need to do the work in the first place. So that now we're going to move on to how work flows across the organization, because the talking about work flowing down the organization is the first half, and it's actually the easy half. So I'd like to start here with an example, because it's really important to understand what's happening, and at the end, there will be a short feedback form for you, and you can give me feedback on this. I'd also appreciate any insights you might have in terms of accountability issues in your organization, because that really helps me to improve this. And hey, we might do a YouTube video on it as well. So in terms of this example, which I would bet dollars to donuts that you feel and have seen in your own organizations, we're going to pick somebody over in operations. We'll call that person Joe, because I don't think we don't have any Joes on here. And over on the left side of your screen, we're going to have Monique in finance. We've got Joe in operations and Monique in finance. Joe's been having a tough day because one of the assembly lines went down on the overnight shift, and his vice president has said that his main priority today is to ensure that that line is going to be up and operating as soon as possible, because they have some very important production runs that need to be out. So in addition to Joe's regular day work, Joe is going to be focused in on getting this running. Monique, on the other hand, also has a really important day because she's accountable for putting together all of the operations summary reports which go to the board. And they're all due in a timely way, so the CEO expects them a couple of days before the board meeting so that they can be distributed in advance. So today is the day that she needs to compile those reports. And guess what? Joe has not submitted his reports, although they were due last week. So the first thing that Monique does is she sends off a text to Joe, where's your report? I really need it. This is the last day. Of course, there's no answer. Text again, no answer. Phone, no answer. Walk over or call a colleague if it's off-site and say, Joe, I really, really need this report because the CFO needs it to give to the CEO, and if I don't get it ready today, it's not going to get out to the board in time. Joe's answer, you can well imagine what it is, says, well, I'm sorry I can't help you. I've got some real work to do today, and I just can't get to that. I'll see if I can get to it tomorrow or the next day, but I just can't have it for you today. So here's a situation in an organization where you've got Monique on the one side is trying to get her work done. She's depending on Joe to be able to do that work. Joe on the other side of the organization has been delegated very important work by the organization, and for him to provide this work to Monique feels more like a favor. You know, I will get to it when I can. So he's been doing this on a monthly basis, kind of as this favor, but sees that now that there's something more urgent in place and important in this case, that's not going to happen. So we have a conflict situation. Now, is Monique a bad person for insisting on this report? Is Joe a bad person for saying he doesn't have time to do the report today? No. What's happened is the organization has created a situation where conflict has now arisen that those two individuals cannot resolve. There's no way for Monique to gather that information without Joe's help, and there's no way for Joe to avoid getting that work done. So so what we're going to do today is I want to give you a few examples of how we can avoid those situations developing, because they do happen over and over again. So the starting point is what is the effective point of accountability in the organization. So when we're delegating work down the organization, the effective point of accountability is as low in the organization as possible, where the person has the capability and the resources to be able to do that work. So you do, I showed you those slides earlier, you do delegate work down, and at some level in the organization it's going to be done. So you want to get it as low as possible in the organization, because that's the most cost-effective place of doing the work. If you do it high, you can get good work done, but it costs too much. If you send it down too low, the person may not have the capability, so that they'll fail at the work. So it might be a cheaper way of doing it, but you're not going to be successful. So you have to do that right. So that's part of the managerial work. So same in the cross-functional. If we're going to resolve Monique and Joe's problem, what we need to do is think, where is the effective point of accountability for that cross-functional work? So the slide that you see here, if you have a team green on the left side of your screen, and you have a process that's specifically within team green, then we'll have this opportunity for the manager of team green to resolve any problems and to direct people to work differently. So that he would be the effective point of accountability for that work. If the work goes across two different teams, then all of a sudden neither the manager of Team Green nor the manager of Team Gold have the authority to tell people on the other teams to work differently. So if the process that needs to be improved impacts on both teams, the only person that has the accountability and the authority to tell people how to work differently and to approve the change in the process would be the manager one level up. So the effective point of ability goes up one level. Now, Manager Green and Manager Gold might be able to collaborate and figure out how to do things differently, and should if they can, but if they can't agree, it does have to go up to the next level. And then finally, we move up to the next level where if the process goes across the entire organization, the only individual that has the accountability and authority to make these changes that would impact everybody is in fact the CEO. So, so that becomes a really important thinking point for us, that when it comes to the effective point of accountability for work that goes across the organization, the effective point of accountability is often much higher than we think it should be. And if this is a short process between any two individuals in the organization, even if they can't resolve it and none of their managers can resolve it, then in fact the CEO is the effective point of accountability. Now that does not mean that the CEO has to do all of the work on their own, does not have to develop the process, monitor the process, and so on. No, you can have someone lower in the organization that would have those accountabilities. But if it can't be resolved anywhere lower in the organization, then something has happened in the context, so that Monique on the one hand and Joe on the other hand are not able to agree. There should be a resolution process to be put in place. So what we want to do is have in place a situation where people are able to, if they can't resolve their differences, have a means of having that resolved by the organization instead of just continuing to have churn month after month after month. So then if you're thinking in your own organization and want to find out who's accountable for cross-functional work, think effective point of accountability and think of that role who has the authority to decide and to direct people to work differently, and the one person that has the authority for all of that, wherever in the organization it is, that's your effective point of accountability. Now I'd like to work on, move forward and share some slides with you. These have not been shared publicly before. They're typically only provided to clients as part of the client organization, but since this is the last webinar and we're talking about Accountability 101, I did want to give this information to you. Before I do that though, I want to give thanks to two people whose work is phenomenal in this area. Elliot Jacks first. He's written over 50 books. The key book that he's had where he talks about cross-functional accountabilities and authorities in organizations is Requisite Organization. It's a tough read. It's dense in terms of the concepts that he's getting across, but it's absolutely phenomenal in terms of understanding this work. As a management consultant, I've implemented this framework for over 10 years from very small to very large multinational organizations, and it works very well. But the problem is that it takes a lot of time and effort to get in place, and it's complex in terms of people being able to maintain that. So once you can get it integrated into an organization very well, and I've had some client organizations that have been able to achieve that, it's great, but it's very, very difficult. It takes a lot of time and resources to get there, and they would agree with that. The other one that I really relied on is Jerry Crane's, and he's written a book called Accountability Leadership, where he drew on Elliot's work and simplified the framework considerably. Still robust, still very sound and easy to, and helpful, but easier to use. So my goal through Effective Managers was to think about how we can take that work and provide something to organizations that is simple enough for managers after they've come out of the training session to say, why didn't I think about that, or that makes absolute sense, so that it becomes almost intuitive going forward, that they use the language and use these concepts to be able to do their work. So I've built on both of these systems and wanted to thank them for that work that goes before. So cross-functional work then is really about work and how work flows across the organization. It's all about the rules of the road. And the key element that we want to have in mind here when we think about cross-functional accountability and authority is that it really standardizes the terms. It creates a language in the organization so that people can have those conversations. For cross-functional work, I would like to start with a really important concept, and often as I've gone into client organizations and they're struggling with this cross-functional work, so I ask, what is the policy for such and such, or what is the standard, or what is the process? And often the answer is, well, we don't have a standard or a process for how we do this work. And if you don't have that standard or process, then you'd have to say, well, how will someone in as diverse an area as operations on one side and finance on the other side come to agree on how they should work with each other? So one of the key points of accountability for the effective point of accountability in the organization is to ensure that there are policies, processes, or standards in place. Doesn't have to develop them personally, but ensures they're in place and approves them to make sure that they're appropriate for that part of the organization, that the person is in place and setting the context for them to do that work, and then ultimately to resolve issues that can't be resolved lower in the organization. So similar to work that flows down the organization, each accountability must have authority that goes with it. In cross-functional work, there's really three categories of work, and this is why I'm talking about simplification. You're either trying to inform someone about something in another part of the organization, or you're trying to persuade someone in another part of the organization to do something differently, or you may have the authority to instruct someone to do things in a different way in another part of the organization. Now remember, these are not manager-subordinate relationships, so these are not the things that my boss can tell me what to do or what not to do. Rather, these are relationships with peers in other parts of the organization. These can be further broken down, so each one of those three types has two subcategories, which I'll tell you in a minute. And each one of these, I can't reinforce it enough, it's even twice on this slide, is that each form of accountability has to come with its own form of authority. So the first one I'd like to talk about then is informing, and the first category within the informing is advising. So this is providing advice. And this is when you have someone in one part of the organization that has expertise, and that expertise needs to be provided to others in the other parts of the organization. So if you're the CEO, you want to be sure that that expertise that's in the organization is available to others. And it's kind of the entry level of cross-functional relationships. If you have this advising accountability, you are accountable to provide this advice to others in special circumstances. So two quick examples. The first one is the CFO, provide and distribute all financial reports. So this is part of the CFO's job. The CFO is accountable for distributing these, and this is advice that's provided to others. The CFO isn't accountable for spending the money. If someone's going slightly over budget in one department, the CFO is not accountable for not spending that money anymore, or to spending less money in the next quarter. The person that's accountable for the budget is accountable for doing that. So the CFO is gathering information and providing it in a way that's going to be helpful to others. Another example is, and this is one that is easily relatable to, if you're a hiring manager and someone from human resources is sitting in on the hiring process, you might ask the hiring, the HR person for their advice. You know, who do you think is the best candidate? And they may well give you that advice. Now, you can choose to accept that advice or not, because at the end of the day, you're going to be accountable for the person that's doing that work. So you will have the final decision, but gathering that advice, receiving that advice is helpful. The second one we have is recommending. So this is still in the informing category. So I have to inform others, but it steps up the complexity a bit. So this is more of a situation where I have special expertise. Someone else in the organization could rely on that expertise to help them make a decision. So they ask me for a recommendation. So I gave you two examples here. If I'm in purchasing, someone in operations or in a plant or in a different part of the organization may have to make a significant investment. and they know that they're going to need a certain degree of supplies over a period of time. So they could ask purchasing for a recommendation in how best to receive those supplies. You know, who would be the supplier, how best to pay for them, what the terms might be, and so on, because that's expertise. They can come back to you then with a series of recommendations and even their preferred recommendation, but you as the business manager are accountable for making that decision, would make the decision based on the advice and the recommendations of that person in that part of the organization. Legal is a perfect example. I like this one because it's really straightforward. In an organization, if it's large enough, there may be a legal department or there may be external legal resources available. But as part of the as someone in the organization needs to make a contract signing decision, usually operations are the ones that take the lead on most of those. I'm asking legal for a recommendation. Legal may look at that contract and say, you know, this clause here is really risky, so I recommend you don't sign this contract. You as the head of the business unit that has to sign the contract may look at that and may say, well, yes, there is more risk there than I'm comfortable with. On the other hand, the benefits are so great that that amount of risk is palatable, is acceptable to me in this situation. So I will take that risk, and I'm going to move forward. Now, I may be accountable at the end of the day as the business manager to the CEO if I've made a decision, incurred risk that was inappropriate, but at least I've had that recommendation, and I have used my business authority to make that decision, and am accountable for the decision at the end of the day. So we move into the second category now. The second category is persuading. So persuading is where I am trying to influence someone in another part of the organization to do something differently. So the entry level in the persuading is coordinating. So I may be given accountability for coordinating work of others in the organization. This is usually project work, so it's teamwork. You might have a major change project in the organization, and you create a project director role. So that project director would be accountable for coordinating the implementation of the project. Now, they're not accountable for calling all of the managers' teams together and delivering the information. The managers would be accountable for that, but they would be accountable for putting in place the plan, for getting the training ready, for providing the administrative support, the maybe some facilitating support, and so on, different programs and services, and monitoring that overall plan to make sure that it is being implemented in a timely way that was agreed upon at the beginning. So you're coordinating that. You have the authority to bring the project team together, so that's part of your your coordinating accountability and authority. And if something's going off the rails, then you have the authority to approach someone to try to convince them to do something differently. So that's the heart of the accountability and authority. So one example is the strategic planning person. The person that's coordinating the strategic planning process isn't accountable for writing the plan, but they are accountable for gathering that information from all the different units in the organization, consolidating that together and presenting it. So if one unit is way behind on the schedule, that will hold up the entire process. So they have the authority to go there to try to convince them to do that work within the timely way. And if they're not successful, then to escalate it for resolution. The next higher level of persuading, pardon me, is monitoring. So this one is directly related to the policy. Remember, I'd mentioned that the EPA is accountable for approving policy standards and so on. If you're going to approve a policy, a standard, or a process, then you also want to be sure that that policy, standard, or process is being followed. So the CEO might delegate to some vice presidents this monitoring, accountability, and authority. So the first example is the CFO. Remember, I gave you this in the advice. So the CFO was given the authority to advise, accountability and authority. The CFO may also be given the accountability and authority to monitor. So in the advising, remember I said that they provide the results of the monthly financial statements, and that's it. Well, in this situation, if they have the monitoring authority and they see some department or business unit exceeding their budget in a quarter, they may have a meeting with them, ask them for a meeting, sit down with them and say, based on these results, it looks like you're going to be over budget. My job is to monitor the budget to make sure that we come in on budget at the end of the year. So what are you doing to make sure that you're not going to go over budget? Will you be spending less this month or next quarter, and so on? So in other words, they enter that persuading. And if they're not successful in persuading their behavior to change, and they feel there's going to be a significant problem, so in their perspective, they think this department is going to be way over budget by year end, then they should initiate the issues resolution process to ensure that that happens. Exactly the same kind of situation in human resources. If one department hasn't done any of the performance appraisals yet, and the deadline is next week, they know it's going to be very, very difficult for them to meet that deadline. They would have the authority to ask why that's not happening. How are they going to meet the deadline? Are they going to meet the deadline? And if the person says, well, I'm just too busy, I'm not going to be able to do it this year, or something, maybe less start, they can try to persuade them to change. If they can't, then they have to enter into the issues resolution process. So that's the next step up, which is monitoring. So the last category is one that I try when we implement this with organizations to implement, to use as in as limited a way and as few times as possible. And the reason for that is that this is actually beginning to interfere with the authority of a manager to delegate tasks to their subordinates. So that's the fundamental part of a manager's job, is to delegate work down. Here we're actually providing peers with some authority to instruct people to do things in a different way, and that can undermine the manager's authority. And there are situations where it's appropriate, so I'll give you some examples here, but we want to be sure that we don't overuse it. So the first one is called stopping. So I may have, in certain circumstances, for a certain limited period of time, the authority to instruct someone to stop what they're doing. So I give the example of the CFO. So if it's become apparent that someone in the organization is going to exceed their signing authority, or they're going to create a risk profile which absolutely exceeds that which the organization is going to be willing to accept, the CFO might quite reasonably ask that person to stop what they're doing if they've been delegated that authority, and if they have, then to ask them to stop doing that work. That's it. If the other individual that has been asked to stop the work doesn't agree, then they can initiate an issues resolution process to get it resolved. But at the end of the day, this person can't stop the work. Similarly, a safety officer in a plant might see work taking place in an unsafe way, and could ask people to stop doing that work. So stop working until that scaffold is made safe, completely within their accountability and their authority. But again, it has to be within a specific work situation. Life or limb is at risk, and for a certain limited amount of time until that can be resolved. So the strongest of the accountability, cross-functional accountability and authority, is actually directing. So in this area, someone can tell someone to do something in a different way. So actually ask them to take a specified action. This is often not used at all in organizations, and if it is used in organizations, it's used in a very, very selective way, as I had indicated earlier. So for example, the operations manager might require employees to evacuate the premises during an emergency situation. So I'm not the boss of you, but you're in my plant. This is an emergency. I'm evacuating. I can require you to leave. There are situations I've seen in nuclear power plants where you have emergency situations in place, and we're thankful that those are in place. In hospitals, this is also used where doctors can prescribe to a nurse to do a certain provide medications to a patient in certain circumstances. They would have the authority, although they're not the boss of the nurse, to require them to do that. So if you put it all together on one page, then you can see that we have three types of cross-functional accountability and authority. We have the informing, we have the persuading, and we have the instructing, and then each one of those has two subcategories. So under informing, we have advising and recommending. Under persuading, we have coordinating and monitoring, and under instructing, we have stopping and directing. And what those are. Now, each one of those comes together with a series of accountabilities, which you can't get on one page, but you can summarize them on one page, which I do here. And in working with clients, we find this a good takeaway for managers. So if I'm in a recommending association with you, this is my authority. If I'm in a monitoring association with you, this is my authority. The importance of this is it creates these concepts which people can use to understand how they work with each other, and it provides a language which is commonly understood. So if I go to you and I say, I have the authority to monitor this work and I'd like to chat with you about so-and-so, you might say, well, gee, I think you're really only having advising authority with respect to this work, so you can give me advice, and I don't think you're monitoring it. So all of a sudden the discussion is more robust because you're understanding all of the stuff that comes behind these terms. And if you can't agree on what that accountability or authority is, then it's not your problem, it's the organization's problem that the context hasn't been set for you. So you each go to your respective managers for clarification. And your manager might say, yeah, you know, it was decided last month that this is a new policy that's going to be monitored because we have to be much more careful around this, and we're going to be managing spending much more closely. So the director of finance will be monitoring our budgets more closely and has that authority. And I was going to be telling you at the staff meeting next week, or whatever. So the system exists to be able to resolve those issues instead of leaving it to fester in the organization, where the one says, no, you're giving me advice, and the other says, no, you really have to do it this way. The other part of cross-functional work that's really important, and we can't leave aside, is the whole concept of services. And services do account for a large majority of the work. So the really important part around accountability is ensuring there's a common framework and understanding between the service provider, you know, how much and what level and quantity of services and quality of services am I going to provide, and me as the recipient of what quantity and quality of services can I expect, so that there's not a disconnect there. So that does take work in the organization. Is well worth the investment of time and energy. I'm not going to spend much time on that except to acknowledge that it's something that you do need to focus in on. I realize that I'm running within a couple of minutes. Got 4 slides to go, so I apologize. I will go a couple of minutes over, and then we'll move that forward. Yeah, I'm getting a couple of notes that a couple of people have had to leave, so my apologies for getting this, but you will get the link so you can catch up on these things. So just to talk about this slide, continuous improvement in cross-functional accountability and authority work is absolutely essential, because it's a different way of thinking about how work is done. Most organizations have the playground mentality that you know, don't tell tales out of school. Work it out, and you know, and you're an adult in the workplace. They say you're an adult now, you're paid a good salary, work it out. And that is not the way to do work in organizations. Certainly they can work it out, but at what cost to them personally and to the organization overall? So if here, let's take Marie and Joe again. So if I don't think it was Marie, it was, oh, anyway, I forget the name now. Anyway, our lady in finance and our guy in operations. So if the two of them can't agree, it's not their fault that they're not able to agree. They, first of all, have to try and work it out. So they have to try to work how to work together, because from each of their understandings, they have to respect that their respective bosses are asking things of them. So they have to try to agree. If they can't agree, then they have to escalate it to their managers, because their managers have a higher level of context, may have forgotten to delegate something, may not have been clear as they should have been in something. So the two of them can then talk to try to resolve out this relationship, which was between Monique and Joe. So Monique and Joe then if the two of them can agree, then the manager of Joe might say, you know, I forgot about that report. That's a really, really important report. So we're going to get some additional resources for you so that you can support that. Or the person in finance might say, oh yeah, you know, we do have this monthly report, but I understand that line being done is really critical. So I'm going to talk to the CFO about how we can delay this report and get it out at a different time. So there are solutions that Monique and Joe don't have the authority to make, that could be made at the next level up. But they may not be able to agree either. They might, one might say this report's really, really important. The other one, getting the lineup is really, really important. So then they would then escalate at the next level up, where there's a higher level of authority again to decide one way or the other. At the end of the day, if they can't resolve, then there really is something that wasn't taken into consideration when this report was put together. So with all good intent, it was decided that we're going to have this monthly report that finance would prepare. Was there enough thought and discussion going into how operations was going to provide the information that's necessary for this report to be prepared? Maybe not. So maybe the CEO didn't do some work with the VP of Operations and the VP of Finance to figure out how we're going to resource this monthly report that's necessary. So if that work didn't happen, why not do it at the top of the organization and in 10 minutes decide it, so that Monique and Joe aren't fighting every month about who should be doing this work and how it's going to get done. The last fundamental point I wanted to describe to you and show you on this slide is how you implement such an accountability and authority framework. And the key here is that it's not training. You don't send 5 people away to training this week and another 7 people next week and so on, because you're not going to get consistency. What we're really doing here in this kind of a framework is we're providing a new conceptual way of thinking and a new language for talking about how we work together in the organization. It's the rules of the road for the organization. So it has to start with the CEO and the vice presidents for them to use this language to solve problems that exist in the organization. So if there has been ongoing conflict at a lower level, at the director or the manager level between operations and finance, invariably when I work with clients, we find that there's been some difference of opinion between the VPs of those 2 areas in terms of how this is going to work. And it filters down that way, and it can't get resolved below that. So let's have the discussion at the senior management table, talk about this in real terms, and decide how it's going to happen. At the next level, once those decisions have been made, then the VP can have similar meetings with their directors, all of the VPs with their respective directors, to have that conversation. So the VP of operations and the CFO as the VP of finance have those discussions with their directors about how we're going to work together in a different way, having had that discussion and talking using terms like advising or monitoring or a service that might be in place, or even in some rare circumstances instructing. And then that rolls out down to the next level. And of course, the very large organizations have more levels, so it takes more place. In my experience, where the help is most often needed in organizations is at the CEO, VP level. Sometimes it's not felt that this is appropriate levels of work. It is. Or sometimes having somebody externally who can make sure that the elephant in the room is actually addressed becomes really, really important. So external support can help there. And if you're going to really implement such a framework, you need to have facilitated meetings throughout the organization. Otherwise, the communication is going to break down. It's that children's whispering game again. So an internal team could be trained at the next level down, and then finally at the bottom of the organization, the internal team of individuals can continue on to do that work. So it needs thought, it needs attention, it needs consistency, but really what it all is about at the end of the day is work. So how do we work together? How do we help people to be more effective at their work? How do we help people to ensure that they're focusing in on the right work and doing the right work? I had a meeting with a client yesterday to talk about this. We implemented the system a year ago, and we had the conversation about what should look differently a year on. And part of it is the conversation should be different in nature. This should be more robust, because they shouldn't be just talking about, you're wrong, no, I'm right, no, you're wrong and I'm right. It should be talking about, do I have the accountability for monitoring, or do I have the accountability for advising? And vice versa, and continuing that on, so that if there has been a disconnect as it comes down, we understand what that disconnect, and we can find where the missing piece is in the organization. And that's the second part of what should be happening, is if you are finding conflict in the organization and you do have a system like this in place, then someone isn't doing their managerial leadership somewhere in the organization. So it may be a VP, it may be a director somewhere, but for whatever reason they're not buying into the system. Find out where that roadblock is and ensure that their manager is doing their managerial leadership work in terms of making sure that the concepts are followed and the people are doing their work and things are happening in the right way. So that was what I wanted to give you for Accountability 101. Gosh, I've got 8 minutes over. That's never happened before. Sorry about that. I hope you found it interesting. I do want to remind you that we have our YouTube channel is up and running. We've got 48 recorded webinars. Some are an hour long, some are half an hour long, and we will be posting these 5 to 10 minute video clips going forward. The first 2 are already up there, part 1 and part 2 in the accountability series. So please do check that out. I think you'll find it a great resource, and please give me some feedback on it, on how I can improve it if you're finding it helpful, or what are specific questions that if I could address those in 5 or 6 or 7 minutes for you, how that might help you to be more effective in your work. That's what I'm all about. So if you do find it useful, also please subscribe. Gives me an idea of how many people are linked in, and you do get notification. I'm also interested in being in touch with you however we can. I publish a monthly e-newsletter. Sometimes it's bi-monthly, but usually I try to get it out every month. You can register for it on it at effectivemanagers.com. And on effectivemanagers.com, I've got a series of blogs. I try to get a new blog up every a week or 2 in terms of talking about issues that may be important to my colleagues and clients out there. For daily tips, follow me on Twitter. Also not always daily, but I do try. And I'm happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn. I find that just a great way to stay in touch. So that brings me to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much. As I said, it is the last, so it's a little with a bit of melancholy that I do say thank you for this one. There will be a very short 3-question survey at the end. If you have time to answer those questions for me, you can skip the one on improving new webinars, I guess. But if you can use it to think about the YouTube, and if you have a specific question that you think would be good for an episode on YouTube, please let me know. Thank you very much again. Have a great rest of the day, evening, or those of you from Asia, a good night. Bye.